Let's be clear at the outset when we talk about a weapon in this context, we are not simply talking about hardware. We are talking about a structural shift, one that exposes deep economic and institutional weaknesses in the Russian system. What Ukraine has unleashed is a combination of technological adaptation, decentralized decision-making, and international integration that Russia's political economy is simply not designed to counter efficiently. And that is where the real problem begins for Vladimir Putin. What is being described as a new weapon is not a missile, a drone, or a piece of machinery rolling off an assembly line. It is something far more disruptive, and that is precisely why it is so difficult to stop. Ukraine has demonstrated that adaptability itself can function as a strategic weapon, one that reshapes the battlefield faster than traditional military power can respond. This is the kind of development that forces established powers to rethink not only tactics, but assumptions they have relied on for decades. At the center of this shift is Ukraine's ability to compress the time between problem and solution. When a vulnerability is exposed, it is not passed upward through layers of bureaucracy, waiting for approval from a distant authority. Instead, local commanders, engineers, civilian technologists, and international partners are able to respond almost immediately. This speed matters more than raw firepower. In modern conflict, the side that learns fastest gains an advantage that compounds over time, turning small innovations into systemic superiority. Consider how civilian technology has been absorbed into military use with remarkable efficiency. Commercial drones, open source software, satellite data, and AI-assisted targeting tools have been repurposed and refined in real time. None of this requires massive factories or years of centralized planning. It requires networks, creativity, and permission to experiment. Ukraine has embraced a model in which failure is informative rather than punished, allowing constant iteration. That stands in stark contrast to rigid systems where mistakes are concealed, not corrected, because accountability threatens political survival. This adaptability also extends beyond the battlefield into production and logistics. Instead of relying on a single industrial base, Ukraine operates through distributed networks that include small workshops, tech startups, volunteer groups, and international suppliers. When one node is disrupted, others compensate. This makes the system resilient in ways that traditional military infrastructure is not. Destroying a factory is effective when production is centralized. It is far less effective when production is scattered, modular, and continuously evolving. There is a powerful psychological hook here that cannot be ignored. Russia entered this war assuming technological superiority and organizational dominance. What it now faces is an opponent that does not play by those rules. Every time Russia adapts to one Ukrainian method, another appears, slightly modified, harder to predict, and cheaper to deploy. This creates a permanent state of reaction rather than control. For a military doctrine built on overwhelming force and predefined plans, being forced into constant adjustment is deeply destabilizing. Equally important is the way Ukraine's adaptability is amplified through international integration. This is not a closed national system operating in isolation. It is plugged into global flows of information, funding, intelligence, and expertise. Updates from the battlefield inform partners abroad who respond with new tools, training, or software adjustments. The feedback loop is fast and continuous. Russia, by contrast, operates under sanctions, restricted access to advanced technologies, and limited collaboration. Its learning process is slower, narrower, and increasingly self-referential. This difference produces a striking imbalance in cost and effectiveness. Ukraine can field solutions that are inexpensive but strategically potent, while Russia is forced to deploy costly countermeasures that drain resources without guaranteeing success. The result is not just material loss, but strategic exhaustion. A system designed for mass production and centralized command struggles when confronted with a nimble, decentralized opponent that treats innovation as a constant rather than an exception. The deeper hook is this: adaptability undermines predictability, and predictability is the foundation of deterrence. When an adversary cannot reliably anticipate your next move, traditional advantages begin to erode. Ukraine's approach introduces uncertainty into every level of Russian planning, from tactical defense to long-term budgeting. This uncertainty is corrosive. It forces overinvestment, overextension, and ultimately doubt within the system itself. What makes this development especially consequential is that it cannot be easily reversed. You cannot bomb a mindset. You cannot sanction a network into rigidity. Once a system learns how to learn faster, that capability persists and evolves. Ukraine has shown that in the modern era, power increasingly belongs not to those who possess the biggest weapons, but to those who can change how weapons, technology, and people are used in real time. That is the kind of weapon that does not announce itself with a launch, but reveals its impact when it is already too late to contain. One of the most underestimated forces shaping this war is not firepower, manpower, or even technology, but time, specifically how long it takes a system to recognize a problem and respond to it. Russia's centralized power structure turns time into a liability. Decisions flow upward through rigid hierarchies, are filtered through political loyalty rather than operational clarity, and return downward often stripped of nuance and delayed beyond usefulness. In a conflict defined by rapid change, that delay is not a minor inconvenience, it is a strategic weakness. The Russian model is built on the assumption that control produces efficiency. Authority is concentrated at the top, and initiative at lower levels is discouraged unless it aligns perfectly with directives from above. On paper, this creates order. In practice, it creates paralysis. Commanders in the field hesitate to report bad news because bad news travels upward with consequences. The result is a distorted picture of reality reaching decision makers who then issue responses based on outdated or incomplete information. By the time corrective action is authorized, the situation on the ground has already shifted. This rigidity becomes especially dangerous in a war where technology evolves in weeks rather than years. When Ukrainian forces introduce a new tactic or tool, responding effectively requires experimentation, rapid feedback, and localized decision-making. Russia's structure resists all three. Any deviation from approved doctrine risks punishment, so adaptation becomes slow, cautious, and incomplete. Instead of empowering officers to improvise, the system trains them to wait. Waiting, in modern warfare, is often the most costly choice. There is also a political hook embedded in this delay. Vladimir Putin's system is not just centralized, it is personalized. Power flows toward a single figure, and that concentration turns military decisions into political signals. Generals are not evaluated solely on competence, but on loyalty. This creates incentives to preserve appearances rather than effectiveness. When a strategy fails, acknowledging it openly becomes dangerous. Adjustments are therefore incremental and cosmetic, designed to maintain the illusion of control rather than confront the source of the problem. The bottleneck effect is compounded by the scale of Russia's military apparatus. Large, centralized organizations require coordination across vast distances and multiple agencies. Each layer adds friction. Orders must be interpreted, translated into operational plans, resourced, and then implemented. Any disruption, logistical, technological, or human, slows the entire chain. Ukraine's more decentralized approach, by contrast, allows multiple nodes to act independently while still aligning towards shared objectives. Speed emerges not from chaos, but from trust in lower level decision makers. This structural imbalance becomes most visible during moments of surprise. When unexpected events occur, centralized systems struggle because they are optimized for predictability. Plans are made in advance. Contingencies are limited, and deviation is seen as failure rather than necessity. Ukraine has repeatedly exploited this by forcing Russia into reactive positions where improvisation is required but culturally discouraged. The longer Russia remains reactive, the further it falls behind in the learning curve. Another hook lies in the human cost of centralization. Soldiers and junior officers who are denied agency often disengage psychologically. When initiative is punished, responsibility fades. This erodes morale and effectiveness in subtle but powerful ways. A force that waits for orders in a fluid environment cannot match one that is encouraged to think, adapt, and act. Over time, this difference translates into operational gaps that no amount of equipment can fully compensate for. The irony is that centralized systems often appear strong until they are tested by sustained pressure. Early in conflicts, their ability to mobilize resources quickly can be impressive, but endurance reveals their fragility. As losses mount and conditions change, the inability to pivot decisively becomes increasingly costly. Russia's slow response to emerging threats is not a temporary problem. It is a feature of how power is organized. What makes this especially consequential is that reforming such a system mid-war is extraordinarily difficult. Decentralization requires trust, transparency, and tolerance for failure, qualities that authoritarian structures are designed to suppress. Attempts to loosen control risk undermining the very hierarchy that sustains political authority. The leadership is trapped between the need to adapt and the fear of losing control, and that trap narrows the range of viable options. In this context, Ukraine's advantage is not simply that it moves faster, but that Russia cannot easily learn how to move faster without fundamentally changing how power operates within its military and state. That kind of transformation is slow, contested, and politically risky. While Russia debates, approves, and reassures itself, the battlefield continues to evolve. And in a war where days can redefine outcomes, a system that turns decision making into a bottleneck hands its opponent an advantage that compounds with every delay. The most dangerous imbalance in this war is not measured in territory gained or lost, but in how much each side pays to keep fighting. Ukraine has found ways to impose costs on Russia that are wildly disproportionate to the resources it expends, and that asymmetry is quietly reshaping the entire conflict. This is the kind of problem that doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic collapse, but accumulates relentlessly day after day until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Russia is operating a war machine built for scale, not efficiency. Its strength lies in mass production, large formations, and expensive platforms designed for traditional warfare. Ukraine has learned how to exploit that structure by forcing Russia to defend against threats that are cheap to create but costly to counter. A relatively inexpensive system can compel Russia to deploy air defenses, relocate assets, reinforce logistics, and increase patrols across vast areas. Each response consumes fuel, manpower, maintenance hours, and money. The exchange ratio matters, and right now it overwhelmingly favors Ukraine. This is where the economic hook tightens. Russia's military spending does not exist in a vacuum. Every ruble spent replacing destroyed equipment or guarding against low cost threats is a ruble not spent on infrastructure, healthcare, pensions, or civilian industry. Wartime economies can absorb shocks for a while, especially when energy revenues provide a buffer. But prolonged asymmetric pressure transforms short-term resilience into long-term distortion. The economy becomes organized around loss management rather than growth, and that is a deeply unstable position. Ukraine's approach exploits a basic economic principle, forcing your adversary to overinvest. When Russia must defend everything, everywhere, all the time, the cost curve bends sharply upward. Protecting strategic assets requires layered defenses, redundancy, and constant readiness. Ukraine does not need to destroy every target. It only needs to make Russia believe that any target could be next. That uncertainty alone drives spending decisions that compound financial strain. There is also a labor dimension to this asymmetry that rarely gets enough attention. Russia's responses require trained personnel, technicians, engineers, operators who cannot be easily replaced. As the war continues, more skilled labor is pulled into military roles or lost altogether. This weakens civilian industries and reduces productivity at home. Ukraine's lower cost methods often rely on smaller teams and flexible roles, spreading the burden rather than concentrating it. Over time, this difference erodes Russia's economic depth. Sanctions intensify every one of these pressures. Access to advanced components, replacement parts, and cutting-edge technology is restricted, making each loss more expensive to repair or replace. What might once have been a routine maintenance issue becomes a logistical puzzle requiring workarounds, substitutes, and delays. Each workaround adds cost. Each delay adds vulnerability. The system becomes less efficient precisely when efficiency matters most. The political hook emerges when these economic realities collide with public expectations. Authoritarian systems can suppress dissent, but they cannot eliminate material consequences. Inflation, labor shortages, and declining public services are felt even when they are not openly discussed. The state is forced to spend more to maintain social stability while simultaneously funding an increasingly expensive war. This is the squeeze point where economic strain translates into political risk. Ukraine's strategy does not require immediate collapse to be effective. It relies on endurance and accumulation. Every high-cost response by Russia today reduces its flexibility tomorrow. Every budget adjustment made to cover military losses narrows future options. Over time, the Russian state becomes less capable of absorbing shocks, whether economic, military, or political. This is not about a single decisive blow. It is about sustained pressure that exploits structural imbalance. What makes this especially potent is that Russia cannot easily change the equation. Shifting to a lower cost, more flexible model would require decentralization, innovation, and tolerance for experimentation, traits that clash with its current political and military culture. The system is locked into a high-cost mode of operation while Ukraine continues to innovate at the margins, finding new ways to stretch Russia's resources thinner and thinner. The deeper reality is that wars are often lost not when armies are defeated, but when economies can no longer support the effort required to avoid defeat. Ukraine's ability to impose asymmetric economic costs forces Russia into a prolonged contest of endurance on unfavorable terms. Each day the war continues under these conditions, the imbalance grows more pronounced, turning time itself into an economic weapon that steadily works against Moscow. Sanctions are often talked about in abstract terms as if they are simply political gestures designed to signal disapproval. But their real power lies in the way they transform capability into constraint. For Russia, sanctions are not just an inconvenience, they are a systemic pressure that amplifies weaknesses already exposed by Ukraine's strategies. Every restriction on technology, finance, or trade hits at the core of what allows Russia to wage war effectively, turning existing vulnerabilities into urgent, compounding problems. One of the most immediate effects of sanctions is technological isolation. Modern warfare depends on sophisticated components, precision optics, high grade electronics, software for guidance and targeting, and specialized materials that cannot easily be sourced domestically. Sanctions prevent Russia from importing these items reliably. That means when Ukrainian innovations or low cost tactics target Russian systems, the responses cannot be replicated quickly or at scale. A damaged radar or drone system cannot be replaced overnight. Every gap in capability translates into operational exposure. Ukraine has learned to exploit these gaps repeatedly, creating a dynamic where Russia is constantly forced to improvise at high cost, often with inferior solutions. Financial sanctions further exacerbate the problem. Access to international banking systems, credit lines, and foreign capital is restricted. This slows procurement, complicates supply chains, and forces Russia to rely on domestic reserves or riskier financial channels. Every transaction becomes more cumbersome, every import more expensive, and every logistical adjustment more uncertain. The war economy, which already strains resources, is pushed closer to a tipping point. Maintaining readiness across thousands of kilometers of front lines is not simply a matter of strategy. It is a matter of dollars, rubles, and convertible currency, all of which are now constrained. Trade restrictions also have a cascading effect on civilian and military sectors alike. Russia's industrial base is interconnected. Shortages of raw materials, electronics, and specialized components in civilian industries can spill over into military production. Factories producing consumer goods may be redirected toward military needs, but this is neither instant nor perfectly efficient. It introduces delays, reduces overall productivity, and forces difficult prioritization decisions. Every choice made to shore up military capability has a corresponding cost elsewhere in the economy, further amplifying the structural strain. The sanctions effect is amplified by time. These measures are not one off shocks, but sustained pressure, creating a situation in which Russia must constantly manage scarcity rather than focus on strategic execution. In modern conflicts, the speed of adaptation matters as much as raw capability. Ukraine's ability to innovate rapidly contrasts sharply with a Russia constrained by sanctions, unable to import replacements, forced to innovate domestically in slower, less efficient ways. That differential compounds, turning what might appear as minor inconveniences into strategic disadvantage. There is a psychological dimension embedded in sanctions as well. Military planners cannot ignore gaps created by restricted imports or delayed supplies. Each failure to replace equipment, each slowdown in logistics introduces uncertainty and risk into operational planning. Commanders must make defensive calculations based on incomplete resources, while political leaders must weigh the consequences of failed operations in real time. The resulting tension pressures decision making, often forcing choices that are reactive rather than proactive, expensive rather than efficient. Another hook lies in the interplay between sanctions and perception. Russia has long presented itself as economically and militarily self-sufficient. Sanctions expose the limits of that narrative. When domestic industries struggle to meet wartime demands, or when key technologies cannot be obtained, the gap between image and reality becomes visible. That undermines credibility both at home and abroad, forcing additional spending on internal messaging and propaganda, a cost that does not exist in a purely operational sense, but is nonetheless very real. Sanctions also shape long-term strategic calculations. They force Russia to consider not only current operations, but future sustainability. Every advanced system destroyed in combat, every high-tech component that cannot be replaced, and every logistical gap left unaddressed becomes a liability in the months ahead. The cumulative effect is a war effort increasingly dictated by what the country can afford to sustain rather than what it wants to achieve militarily. Ukraine benefits from this dynamic without directly engaging in every aspect of Russian economic management. The pressure is structural, systemic, and persistent. The broader lesson is that sanctions act as more than external pressure. They transform operational realities. By constraining access to technology, finance, and trade, they turn Russia's existing weaknesses into magnified vulnerabilities. Ukrainian forces exploit these vulnerabilities in real time, creating a feedback loop in which scarcity generates inefficiency. Inefficiency increases exposure, and exposure demands high cost responses. In this context, sanctions are not just punitive measures. They are tools that shape the strategic landscape, forcing Russia to fight a war under conditions increasingly dictated by limitations rather than capability. Every day that these pressures persist, the asymmetric advantage shifts further toward Ukraine, creating a situation in which the external environment itself becomes an active participant in the conflict. One of the most overlooked but profoundly consequential aspects of this conflict is the intersection of military performance and political legitimacy. Authoritarian systems, by their nature, rely heavily on the perception of competence. They demand that the state appear omnipotent, infallible, and in complete control. In Russia's case, the Kremlin has built a narrative for domestic audiences that the country is strong, capable, and technologically superior. Every failure to deliver on that promise undermines the very foundation of authority. And Ukraine's strategy is increasingly exposing cracks in that narrative. The danger for Putin is not only tactical, but existential in terms of public perception. When a state promises security and demonstrates vulnerability instead, trust erodes incrementally, often without dramatic confrontation. Ordinary citizens may not openly protest, especially under an authoritarian regime, but they notice resource misallocation, rising costs, declining services, and repeated military setbacks. These are tangible signals that the state's competence is not absolute, and over time they accumulate. Each unexplained failure, each costly misstep, feeds into a broader awareness that the system may be less capable than it claims, creating cognitive dissonance that is politically destabilizing. This dynamic is amplified by the visibility of the war. In the age of digital media, satellite imagery, social platforms, and real-time reporting make it impossible for the state to fully control the narrative on the battlefield. Failures are documented, circulated, and dissected globally and domestically. Even carefully orchestrated propaganda struggles to maintain credibility when the evidence on the ground contradicts official claims. Ukraine's capacity to innovate and deploy low-cost yet effective strategies magnifies this effect because it creates repeated, observable disruptions that cannot be easily explained away. Each success on Ukraine's part is a corresponding embarrassment for Russia. There is also a financial hook embedded in this legitimacy equation. Every misstep in military operations forces the state to spend more to compensate, not only to repair or replace lost equipment, but also to manage the perception of competence domestically. Propaganda, loyalty programs, bonuses for military personnel, and social messaging campaigns all cost money. Resources that could otherwise support civilian welfare or long-term strategic investments are diverted to shore up appearances. The result is a war economy that is not just financially stressed, but politically strained, as every ruble spent on messaging is an acknowledgement that failure exists. Authoritarian systems are particularly sensitive to this kind of feedback because dissent, even if muted, tends to cluster around perceived incompetence rather than ideology. Citizens may accept restrictions, surveillance, or economic hardship if they believe the state is effective and purposeful. But when repeated errors and failures accumulate, the legitimacy underpinning compliance weakens. This creates subtle but powerful pressures on the regime, forcing it to overcompensate with displays of control, tighter messaging, or punitive measures, all of which consume resources and further distort priorities. Another critical hook is the psychological burden on leadership. When a state presents itself as infallible, leadership cannot openly acknowledge mistakes without risking political credibility. This forces decision makers to double down on failing strategies, delay necessary reforms, and prioritize optics over effectiveness. In a dynamic conflict, delay and rigidity are costly. The longer the leadership suppresses acknowledgement of reality, the greater the gap between actual performance and public expectation, and the harder it becomes to adapt effectively. Ukraine's adaptive approach takes direct advantage of this misalignment, forcing Russia into reactive, politically constrained positions. The perception of competence also directly affects morale within the military. Soldiers and officers internalize the state's narrative. When reality consistently fails to match that narrative, equipment fails, strategies falter, supply chains break down, confidence erodes. Low morale reduces effectiveness, slows response times, and increases operational risk. The effect is self-reinforcing. Poor performance undermines confidence, and diminished confidence leads to further poor performance. Ukraine's ability to maintain high operational effectiveness with limited resources highlights this contrast sharply, making the gap between claimed competence and observable performance impossible to ignore. This erosion of perceived competence has broader strategic implications. Domestic audiences begin to question the state's capacity to manage not just the war, but the economy, infrastructure, and social stability. International observers take note, altering diplomatic calculations and alliances. Potential allies hesitate, adversaries gain leverage, and the system is forced into reactive, defensive postures that limit flexibility and strategic creativity. Each failure becomes more than a tactical setback. It is a pressure point in the political and economic system itself. In this environment, Ukraine's repeated successes, often achieved through ingenuity and asymmetric tactics, act as multipliers of pressure. They are not simply battlefield victories. They are evidence that Russia cannot deliver on the promises it has made to its own people. Every victory highlights systemic inefficiencies, amplifies the cost of maintaining legitimacy, and forces the Kremlin to commit resources in ways that may be strategically unwise. The combination of visible failure, economic strain, and eroding confidence creates a complex web of pressures that cannot be easily countered by traditional military or political measures. It is a form of leverage that extends far beyond the battlefield, targeting the fragile foundation of authority itself. In modern conflict, the ability to endure systemic stress often outweighs the immediate impact of firepower. Ukraine's advantage lies not merely in individual victories on the battlefield, but in its capacity to operate within a flexible, resilient framework that adjusts continuously to new threats and challenges. History is filled with examples of conflicts where superior weaponry failed to secure lasting dominance because rigid systems could not adapt to changing circumstances. This is precisely the strategic leverage Ukraine is cultivating, and it is a challenge Russia is ill-equipped to meet. Flexibility in this context is more than improvisation. It is embedded in decision, making production, and operational execution. Ukrainian forces are encouraged to identify problems, experiment with solutions, and deploy them rapidly. Civilian technology is adapted for military purposes, volunteers contribute innovations, and small units can act independently while still contributing to a broader strategic objective. Each layer of autonomy accelerates adaptation, creating a system that continuously learns and evolves. This capacity to iterate is itself a form of power because it turns uncertainty, a traditional advantage of the attacker, into an operational tool for Ukraine while leaving Russia perpetually reactive. Russia's centralized hierarchical structure is ill suited to this dynamic. Decisions must pass through multiple layers of command. Approvals are filtered by political loyalty rather than operational urgency, and deviations from established doctrine are discouraged. This creates lag times, miscommunications, and operational inertia. When new Ukrainian tactics emerge, Russian forces cannot respond in real time. Even when adjustments are eventually implemented, the pace of adaptation is slower, less precise, and far more costly. In this asymmetry, Ukraine gains not only tactical advantage, but strategic endurance, gradually widening the operational gap. There is a striking economic hook to this dynamic. A flexible system requires fewer resources to maintain effectiveness because it can compensate for losses and inefficiencies through innovation and decentralized problem solving. A rigid system, by contrast, must overcompensate through redundancy, mass production, and concentrated resource deployment. This imbalance compounds over time. Every high-cost response Russia must mount consumes capital, labor, and materials, while Ukraine achieves disproportionate results with limited expenditure. The disparity in cost effectiveness erodes Russian capacity and strengthens Ukraine's relative position in both military and economic terms. Psychological and moral factors further magnify the advantage of flexibility. Personnel operating within a system that rewards initiative, innovation, and adaptability maintain higher morale and engagement. Soldiers and commanders who see their ideas implemented and adjusted in real time develop confidence in their abilities and the system as a whole. Conversely, personnel in rigid hierarchies face repeated frustration, delayed responses, and punitive measures for perceived mistakes. Over time, this erodes morale, slows decision-making, and increases the likelihood of operational errors. Ukraine's approach turns adaptability into a multiplier, amplifying both human and technological effectiveness. Another critical element is the role of uncertainty in modern conflict. Flexibility allows Ukraine to operate effectively in ambiguous, rapidly changing situations where perfect information is never available. By contrast, Russia's rigid structure amplifies the risk of miscalculation under uncertainty. The requirement for centralized approval and adherence to pre-existing plans prevents rapid course correction, leaving Russian forces vulnerable to exploitation. Every Ukrainian innovation, whether a tactical adjustment or an improvised technology, introduces variables that Russia struggles to absorb, forcing it to expend disproportionate effort on defensive measures and reactionary deployments. International integration further strengthens Ukraine's system. Unlike Russia, which faces isolation due to sanctions and geopolitical constraints, Ukraine taps into global networks of intelligence, technology, and finance. Feedback loops are rapid and continuous. Lessons from the battlefield inform foreign partners who, in turn, provide tools, training, or resources that enhance Ukraine's adaptability. The effect is compounded. Each iteration of adaptation is not merely internal, but augmented externally, creating a dynamic, evolving system with strategic depth. Perhaps the most significant hook is that endurance in war is cumulative. Flexibility is not about winning every engagement outright. It is about creating conditions in which the adversary steadily weakens over time while one's own system remains robust. Ukraine's structure allows it to absorb shocks, learn from mistakes, and deploy corrective measures efficiently. Russia, constrained by centralization, political imperatives, and economic pressures, experiences degradation with every failed adaptation. Time, which might normally favor a larger power, instead magnifies the advantages of Ukraine's responsive and resilient system. The difference between flexibility and rigidity ultimately shapes the trajectory of the conflict. Systems that can endure stress, integrate lessons quickly, and allocate resources efficiently are far more likely to prevail over systems that rely on scale, hierarchy, and inertia. Ukraine's ongoing capacity to innovate, adapt, and sustain operations under pressure creates a long term structural advantage. Every miscalculation, every forced expenditure, and every delay in Russian adaptation reinforces the asymmetry. The battlefield is not just defined by individual encounters, it is defined by which system can outlast and outlearn the other, a distinction that increasingly favors Ukraine in ways that raw numbers or conventional metrics alone cannot capture. History teaches us that wars are rarely decided by force alone. They are decided by which system can endure its own contradictions the longest. Tonight, Putin's problem is not merely Ukraine's latest capability, it is that Russia's political and economic system is being pushed to reveal limits it cannot easily overcome. And once those limits become visible, the outcome of the conflict is no longer just a military question, but a systemic one.